The dress was the most beautiful thing Ellie had ever worn, and it was going to get her killed. She had known something was wrong for 3 days. Not the sharp, unmistakable wrongness of a blade pressed to the throat. Something quieter than that. Something that moved beneath the surface of every conversation, like a current beneath frozen water. A look exchanged too quickly between her stepmother and Lord Cressy at the rehearsal dinner. Her half-sister Mira's fingers trembling as she pinned the veil into Ellie's hair that morning, not from emotion, but from something colder. The way the older servants had stopped meeting her eyes entirely. Ellie had told herself she was imagining things. She had been telling herself that for years. The chapel of Thornwall Manor smelled of beeswax and white roses, and every pew was filled with the noble families of the northern reaches, lords and their mates, alphas and their councils, all assembled to witness the union of Eleanora Voss, daughter of the late High Chancellor Voss, to Lord Edmund Cressy, alpha of the Irongate pack. It was supposed to be a triumph. Her father had arranged it before his death, scrawled the contract in his own hand, sealed it with the Voss sigil. A promise of safety, a promise of belonging. Ellie stood at the entrance of the chapel, her bouquet of winter jasmine trembling in her hands, and breathed in slowly. The roses smelled wrong, not rotten, not obviously corrupted, but beneath the sweetness there was something astringent and faintly metallic, the way certain herbs smelled when they were ground into powder and mixed with tinctures meant to dull the senses. She'd spent 2 years in her father's apothecary wing after he died, cataloging his research, reading his journals on poisons and compounding. She knew that smell. She had read about it in his most private notes, the ones he kept locked in the cedar chest she was never supposed to touch. Wolfsbane extract. Refined, nearly undetectable. Her eyes swept the chapel from the doorway. Lord Edmund stood at the altar, tall, composed, handsome in the way that had always made her feel slightly ashamed of her own uncertainty. He was smiling. Beside him, her stepmother Constance occupied the front pew in deep burgundy silk, her expression carefully arranged into maternal pride. Mira sat at her side, staring at her folded hands. The roses were in every arrangement along the aisle. Ellie's lungs constricted. She thought of the tea she had been given that morning. Constance herself had brought it, which had struck Ellie as unusually attentive. "For your nerves, darling. You look pale." She had drunk half of it before Mira's trembling hands had distracted her. She had set the cup down and forgotten it. Half a cup. If the dose had been measured for a full cup, she had taken half. Her wolf, the quiet, uncertain creature that had always been her own wolf, small and shy compared to the great shifters around her, stirred inside her chest. Not a growl. More like an animal pressing itself against a wall, sensing fire. Ellie did not walk into the chapel. She stepped back. 1 step, then 2, her satin slippers silent against the stone threshold, the bouquet of poisoned jasmine still clenched in her white-knuckled hands. The music had started, the low, formal processional that meant she was expected to appear in the doorway and begin her walk. Any moment, the assembled guests would turn to look. She turned instead and walked in the other direction. Not running. Not yet. She moved with the deliberate, even pace of a woman who had simply forgotten something, down the side corridor that flanked the chapel wall, past the sconces where the candle flames bent as she passed. Her veil caught on the iron wall bracket and she yanked it free without stopping, the pins tearing from her hair. The train of her dress dragged on the stone floor, catching on the uneven mortar between the slabs. She heard the music pause behind her. Then voices, low, urgent, Constance's unmistakable pitch rising above the others. Ellie ran. The corridor emptied into the servants' passage, and then into the side courtyard, where the flagstones were slick from the morning's frost, and the bare oak trees stood stripped and pale against a white sky. Her breath came in hard, visible bursts. Her satin slippers were immediately soaked through, the cold seeping into her feet, but she did not stop. The dress was enormous. 4 layers of ivory silk, a bodice structured with boning, a train that she had to gather in both hands to keep from tripping. She ran anyway, clumsily, half stumbling down the narrow path that wound toward the estate's eastern gate. Behind her, she heard the chapel doors open, then shouting. She did not look back. The eastern gate was locked. She had known it might be. But the old keeper's postern beside it was not. Her father had shown it to her once, years ago when she was small. Always know your exits, Ellie. A Voss never enters a room without knowing how to leave it. She found the narrow door by feel, half hidden behind the climbing ivy that had gone brown and dry in the autumn cold. The latch lifted with both hands. She pushed through and stumbled into the road. The northern road was empty at this hour, the packed dirt hard beneath her thin-soled shoes, the surrounding forest pressing close on both sides. The oak and pine stretched away into shadow, the branches interlocked overhead, and the cold came down through them in a steady, breath-stealing wave. She had no cloak, no coin. Nothing but a ruined dress and the chemical knowledge that someone had been trying to poison her slowly enough that it would look natural, look like illness, look like the fragile constitution everyone had always attributed to the daughter of Voss, who hadn't inherited a wolf strong enough to matter. She had gone perhaps a quarter mile when she heard the hoofbeats, not behind her, ahead. Emerging from the road's curve between the tree line, a group of riders moving at an unhurried pace, the kind of pace that belonged to men who owned the roads they traveled. They were large, all of them. The horses were enormous. The riders wore dark traveling cloaks without insignia, but the way they moved, loose-backed, watchful, the fluid economy of men who trained constantly, spoke of something more than ordinary road traffic. The one at the front drew his horse to a stop when he saw her. Ellie stopped too. She was standing in the middle of the road in a destroyed wedding dress, her veil gone, her hair half pinned and half loose around her shoulders, her feet wet and her bouquet of poisoned flowers still inexplicably clutched in her hands. She looked. She was quite certain, completely deranged. The rider at the front studied her for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more contained than that. Something that held both amusement and something sharper beneath it. He was not a lord in the ordinary sense. She understood that in the first 3 seconds of looking at him, in the way she understood the wolfsbane smell, not through logic, but through every instinct, her small, uncertain wolf possessed suddenly snapping to full attention. He was tall in the saddle with the particular stillness of someone who did not need to perform authority because he simply had it. His jaw was set hard, his dark eyes moving over the scene in front of him with precise, unhurried assessment. His cloak was plain, but the horse beneath him was anything but. A great gray animal, powerfully built, that shifted its weight and went still when he did. He looked at the dress, at the road behind her, where distant shouting was beginning to carry through the cold air, at the poisoned flowers in her hands, at her face. "Perfect," he said, and his voice was low, unhurried, with the same quality as the rest of him, like something that had never needed to be raised to be heard. "I needed a wife." Ellie stared at him. Under different circumstances, under almost any other circumstances that had ever existed in her life, she would have been appalled. Instead, she felt her wolf press forward for the first time in years, a small creature standing up from the wall where it had been hiding, and the smell of wood smoke and pine resin and something cold and clean moved toward her on the wind. Behind her, the voices were getting closer. She did not take his hand. That was the first thing she decided. Standing in the frozen road with the shouting growing louder behind her, and this stranger watching her from the height of his gray horse, with an expression that gave nothing away. He had extended a gloved hand downward, not dramatically, not as a command, simply as an offering, the way a man might hold a door open. And Ellie looked at it, and looked at him, and made the calculation that every sensible person makes when the choice is between a known danger and an unknown one. She took 3 steps forward and gripped the saddle's side strap herself, pulling up without assistance, swinging her leg over the back of the horse with considerably less grace than she would have liked, the enormous skirt of the wedding dress bunching and catching until she was seated behind him in a ridiculous arrangement of ivory silk that covered most of the horse's hindquarters. Something in the set of his shoulders suggested he found this mildly impressive. He didn't say anything. He simply turned the horse and the group of riders moved, not at a gallop, which would have announced urgency, but at a brisk, purposeful canter that covered ground efficiently and suggested nothing more dramatic than men with a destination. The riders flanking him adjusted without being told, two falling back to close the road behind them. Ellie looked over her shoulder. 3 figures had emerged from the estate gate onto the road. She could see Constance's burgundy skirts, and beside her the broader shape of Lord Edmund, moving with the contained fury of an alpha who had just been publicly humiliated. They stopped when they saw the riders. Even at this distance, she could see Edmund's posture change. He recognized the horses, or the riders, or something about the formation. Whatever he recognized, it stopped him on the road as completely as a wall. Then the curve of the road took them around the tree line, and the estate was gone. Ellie faced forward and concentrated on breathing. The man in front of her said nothing for a long while. The forest moved past on both sides, the bare branches overhead letting through a flat winter light. The horse's rhythm was steady beneath her, and she became acutely aware of her own state. Soaked feet, torn hair, the faint residual nausea that she was now quite sure was the partial dose of wolfsbane extract working through her system, making the edges of things slightly soft and her wolf feel muffled, as though heard through water. "You're ill," he said. Not a question. "I'm cold," she said, which was also true and more defensible. A pause. "You're also poisoned." Her grip on the saddle strap tightened. "I don't know what you're referring to." "The flowers," he said. "You've been holding them for 20 minutes. You should drop them." She looked down at the bouquet of winter jasmine, which she had entirely forgotten she was still carrying, and released it. It fell into the road behind them without ceremony. "Wolfsbane," he said. "Refined. The kind that compounds with prolonged skin contact." The cold settled more completely into her bones. "You can smell that." "From the road." Another pause. "You knew before you ran." It was not a question either. She did not answer it like one. "I noticed the smell during the processional." "And before that?" She thought of the tea, of Mira's trembling hands, of 3 days of looks exchanged too quickly in rooms she wasn't supposed to be watching. "Before that," she said, "I was not paying sufficient attention." The rider said nothing to this. She had the sense that he was filing it away rather than dismissing it. "Who are you?" she asked, because she had run out of reasons to avoid it. The pause before his answer was not hesitation. It was something more deliberate than that, as though he were deciding how much to give her. "Darius," he said. Just the name. No title, no pack designation, no formal introduction. She had been raised in her father's house with every courtly convention drilled into her, and she knew that a man who introduced himself with only his given name in a formal exchange was either being rude or was so far above the necessity of titles that offering one would have been redundant. She turned the name over in her mind. Darius. She had heard it. She was certain she had heard it. In her father's council meetings, when she had been small enough to sit beneath the long table unnoticed, in the whispered conversations of northern lords at her father's dinner table, in the margins of her father's correspondence that she had read after his death while cataloging his affairs. The Alpha King. Not an alpha of a pack, not a regional lord, not a council seat or a territorial commander. The Alpha King. The one who held the compact of the northern reaches, the treaty that kept 17 packs from tearing each other apart. The one the northern lords deferred to not because of bloodline alone, but because of something else, something that apparently came off him like weather. She was beginning to understand what that something was. Seated behind him on a horse, while her poisoned blood moved sluggishly through her veins, and her wolf pressed against the inside of her chest, like an animal leaning into warmth it hadn't expected to find. She should not lean toward him. She leaned very slightly toward him anyway, because he was warm, and she was freezing, and her body was making decisions her mind had not approved. Ellie, she said, Eleonora Voss, daughter of High Chancellor Voss. She paused. Late High Chancellor. I know who you are, he said. This startled her more than anything else that had happened that morning. You do. Your father was a careful man, Darius said. He built things meant to last. His death left certain arrangements unfinished. The forest was beginning to thin ahead, and through the trees, she could see the pale stone walls of a way station. One of the compact's maintained stops along the northern road, she realized. The kind staffed with compact riders and stocked for extended travel. The group was moving toward it without slowing. What arrangements? She said, and it came out flatter than she intended because her head was beginning to ache in the specific, bone-deep way that wolfsbane poisoning produced when the dose was partial and the body was fighting it. He did not answer immediately. They rode through the way station's gate, and the riders around them dissolved into practiced efficiency. Horses led to the stable, packs unloaded, a fire being built up in the main room's hearth before she had fully registered that they had arrived. Someone brought a blanket, which was placed around her shoulders by a woman with close-cropped gray hair and a medic's apron, who said nothing, simply wrapped her firmly and guided her toward the fire with the no-nonsense competence of someone who had seen considerably worse. Darius dismounted and handed his horse off without looking. He came to stand beside the hearth rather than across the room, close enough that she could see the detail of him clearly for the first time. The scar that ran along the left jaw, old and faded, the kind that came from something serious. The dark eyes that were currently studying her with an attention so complete it was almost uncomfortable, like being read by someone who was very good at it. Your father sent me a letter, he said. 8 months before he died. He had reason to believe the arrangements he had made for your future were not what he had been told they were. The fire crackled. Ellie's fingers were beginning to thaw inside the blanket, and the sensation was unpleasant in the specific way that returning circulation always was. He thought Edmund Cressy was a safe match, she said carefully. He thought so initially. Later, he had doubts. Darius was watching her face. He wrote asking me to look into Cressy's financial arrangements, his debts, and his alliance with your stepmother. The word alliance landed in her chest like a stone into still water. Constance, she said. Constance Voss Nehero, he said, who stands to inherit the Voss estate and title in the event of your death, unmarried or married to someone incapable of holding the claim. Cressy's debts are substantial. The estate is considerably more so. He paused. The wolfsbane wouldn't have killed you on the altar. It would have compounded over time. Weeks, perhaps, of declining health, attributed to a fragile constitution. The fire was very loud in the silence that followed. Ellie thought of her father's hands on her face when she was small, rough and warm, smelling of cedar and ink. She thought of the locked cedar chest. She thought of how carefully he had always tried to protect her from a world that moved faster and harder than she did, and how he had apparently, in the end, seen what was coming and tried to leave her something more reliable than a marriage contract. He had written to the Alpha King. He asked you to protect me, she said. He asked me to investigate, Darius said. I arrived today to do that. The corner of his mouth moved again, that same contained expression that was not quite a smile. You had already begun investigating on your own. I ran out of a chapel in a wedding dress, she said. That's not an investigation. You identified the poison, identified the source, and removed yourself from the situation before anyone could stop you. He looked at her steadily. In approximately 4 minutes, from what I could estimate. She was quiet for a moment. The ache in her head was easing slightly with the warmth, and her wolf, still muffled, still slow, had settled into something less like panic and more like a wary, watchful stillness. You said you needed a wife, she said. I said it, he agreed. Was that a joke? The pause this time was different, more deliberate. Not entirely, he said. She looked at him across the firelight. He looked back. The way station around them was warm and smelled of wood smoke and horses and the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. And somewhere outside the winter wind was moving through the pines. And Ellie was acutely aware that she was sitting in a borrowed blanket in a destroyed wedding dress having the strangest conversation of her life with the most powerful alpha in the northern reaches. Her wolf leaned toward him again, steady and quiet, like a compass finding north. She pulled the blanket tighter and looked away. She slept for 11 hours. Not peacefully. Sleep after Wolfsbane was never peaceful. Her father's journals had been clear about that. It was thick and dark, and full of half-formed images that dissolved before she could hold them. Her father's study with the cedar chest open and empty, Mira's hands trembling over the veil pins, Edmund's smile at the altar that she now understood had never contained anything resembling warmth. She dreamed of white roses with something wrong beneath the sweetness. She dreamed of a wolf she barely recognized as her own standing at the edge of a dark forest, watching a gray light move between the trees. She woke in a narrow bed with clean linen sheets that smelled of lavender and wood soap. In a room she had not seen the night before because she had been half unconscious when the gray-haired medic had guided her into it. Morning light came through a single high window, thin and pale, the kind that belonged to deep winter. Her feet had been wrapped in dry wool. Someone had removed the wedding dress. She registered this with a complicated surge of something between relief and humiliation, and replaced it with a plain linen sleeping shift. On the chair beside the bed sat a folded set of clothing, dark wool trousers, a cream linen shirt, a charcoal riding jacket with brass buttons, thick wool stockings, and boots that looked like they might actually be close to her size. Beside the boots, a cup of something that was still faintly warm. Not tea. She checked before she drank it, smelled it carefully, turned the cup in both hands, held it near the light from the window. Chamomile and ginger and something else she identified after a moment as a mineral compound her father used in his restorative drafts, the kind meant to flush residual toxin from the blood. Clean. Completely clean. She drank it in 4 long swallows and dressed. The main room of the way station was occupied when she came through the door. 3 of the riders from the previous day sat at the long table with maps and cups of something hot, speaking in low voices that paused when she entered. Darius stood at the far window with his back to the room, looking out at the courtyard where 2 horses were being readied in the cold morning air. He turned when she came in. His eyes moved over her once, a swift, comprehensive assessment that she was beginning to recognize as habitual rather than intrusive, the same way a man checks that a door is properly latched or a fire properly screened. "Better?" he said. "Considerably," she agreed, which was true. The bone-deep ache was gone. Her wolf was still quieter than usual, still slightly muffled, but present in a way that felt more solid than it had in months, perhaps longer. She had grown so accustomed to her wolf's reticence that she had stopped expecting more from it. She sat at the end of the table. Someone placed bread and hard cheese in front of her without being asked, and she ate with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that her body needed fuel, regardless of how strange the circumstances were. "I need to understand the full situation," she said, when she had eaten enough to think clearly. She looked at Darius. Not the outline. The full situation. He came to the table and sat, which surprised her slightly. She had expected him to remain standing, to maintain the distance that authority usually preferred. He sat across from her and folded his hands on the map in front of him and looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention. "Cressy's debts," he said, "are owed primarily to 3 creditors. 2 are financial houses in the Southern Territories. The 3rd is your stepmother." Ellie went very still. "Constance has been lending Cressy money for 4 years," he continued, "long before your father proposed the match. The marriage was not your father's arrangement exactly. It began as your father's intention, but Constance shaped it. She introduced Cressy to your father as a suitable candidate. She provided the recommendation, the background, the assurances of character." He paused. She had been planning this since before your father became seriously ill. She made him ill, Ellie said. The words came out very flat and very steady, which surprised her. Darius did not look away. We believe so. Slowly. The same method. The same compound. In your father's case, the dose was sustained over 2 years. The room was quiet, except for the fire. Ellie looked at the table surface. The worn grain of the wood, the rings left by cups over years of travelers stopping at this same table, and let the information settle into the place inside her, where things went when they were too large to process immediately. Her father. 2 years. Constance's hands bringing him broth in the evenings. The devoted second wife nursing her ailing husband. Everyone saying how remarkable her dedication was. My brother, she said. One of the riders at the table shifted. She caught it. The small, involuntary movement of a man who knows something he has not been told to share yet. She looked at Darius. Your brother Thomas, he said carefully, is alive. The word alive hit her like cold water, because it meant the question of whether he was alive had already been on the table, which meant the answer could have been different. Thomas was 23, 4 years younger than she was, and had been sent to the Eastern Border Territories 18 months ago, as part of what Constance had described as a diplomatic apprenticeship arranged through Lord Cressy's contacts. Letters had arrived for the first several months, then less frequently. Then Constance had explained that the Eastern post roads were unreliable, that Thomas was simply busy, that Ellie worried too much. Where is he? She said. Held at Cressy's Eastern outpost, Darius said. Not imprisoned formally, nominally still serving in the diplomatic capacity, but his correspondence is controlled, his movements are restricted, and he has been kept there specifically because his presence near you or near the Voss estate would have complicated Constance's arrangements considerably. He's leverage, she said. He was leverage, Darius said, against your compliance, if you had shown any resistance to the marriage. And after your death, his claim to the Voss estate would have needed to be addressed. Cressy had plans for that, too. Ellie pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed. In through the nose, slowly, the way her father had taught her when she was small and frightened, and her wolf was too shy to provide any comfort. The mind is its own anchor, Ellie. Use it. What does Cressy want with the Voss estate specifically? She said. He has his own territory, his own pack. His own pack that is hemorrhaging members, said one of the other riders, a broad-shouldered man with a close-trimmed beard, who glanced at Darius before continuing. 3 significant families have left Irongate Pack in 2 years. His authority is fracturing. The Voss estate and its associated land grants in the Northern Valley would give him a territorial expansion that could stabilize his position in the Compact Council. And Constance gets the title and the financial holdings, Ellie said. And Thomas becomes inconvenient. Silence confirmed it. She sat with this for a moment. Then she looked at Darius and asked the question she had been holding since the previous night, the one she had been waiting until her head was clear enough to ask properly. Why did my father write to you specifically? Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible, but she was watching carefully. Your father and I had an old understanding, he said. He was one of 3 men I trusted absolutely in the Northern Territories. When he died, I lost that. He paused. When I received his letter, I understood that he had known he was dying. He was not asking me to investigate. He was asking me to make sure you survived it. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, one of the horses in the courtyard shifted its weight, the sound of the hoof against stone carrying clearly through the cold air. You said last night that you needed a wife, Ellie said. I want to understand what that means. Darius was quiet for a moment, not evasively, but with the deliberateness of a man who chose his words, because imprecision was a form of dishonesty he did not permit himself. I have a council who have been pressuring me to formalize an alliance through marriage for 2 years, he said. I have declined every candidate they have proposed, because every candidate has been proposed for political reasons that had nothing to do with compatibility or trust. He met her eyes. I also have 17 PACs held in compact treaty, and one of those PACs is currently plotting the murder of a woman under my father's oldest ally's protection, which makes it a compact matter, which means I have both the authority and the obligation to act. He paused. If you were under my protection formally, if you were my mate, my wife, my Luna, Cressy could not touch you or your brother without declaring war on the compact itself. It would end it. Immediately and completely. Ellie looked at him for a long time. You're describing a political arrangement, she said. I'm describing a beginning, he said carefully. What it becomes is not something I would decide unilaterally. Her wolf, still quiet, still slightly muffled from the poison, pressed forward again in that same steady way. Not excitement, not urgency, something more patient than either. Like recognition. Like the particular feeling of finding a word for something that had previously been wordless. She did not trust it. She had trusted feelings before, and the feelings had led her to the end of a poisoned aisle. My brother first, she said. Darius nodded once. Your brother first. And I want to understand every part of what you know before any decision is made. Everything your investigation found. Every document, every debt record, every piece of correspondence. Agreed. And I am not... She stopped, started again. I am not a piece in this arrangement. I am not something that gets moved from one man's protection to another's. I am asking to understand the full situation so that I can make a real decision, not a desperate one. He looked at her across the table in the winter morning light, and his expression held something she had not expected, something that looked carefully contained, very much like respect. I know the difference, he said quietly. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she looked at the map on the table between them, at the Eastern Territories marked in faded ink, and thought of Thomas in a room with restricted correspondence and controlled movements, 23 years old, waiting for a letter that Constance had been intercepting for a year and a half. Show me where he is, she said, and Darius turned the map toward her. They rode east for 2 days. Ellie had expected to be managed, kept at the way station, told to rest, handed information in careful portions while the real work happened around her without her participation. That was how it had always been. Her father, for all his love, had shielded her from his council meetings. Constance had managed her schedule, her correspondence, her social calendar, her understanding of her own estate's finances. Edmund, in the brief months of their formal courtship, had spoken to her the way men spoke to decorative objects, pleasantly, without expecting a response that contained actual content. Darius did none of these things. On the first morning, he spread 3 years of documented correspondence across the way station table and walked her through it without simplifying. Cressy's debt ledgers, obtained through the Compact's Financial Oversight Authority. Constance's private letters to Cressy, intercepted by Compact writers over the previous 4 months, that detailed the poisoning timeline with a clinical precision that made Ellie's stomach turn and then harden into something colder than nausea. Her father's original letter to Darius, written in the High Chancellor's careful, slightly labored hand, the handwriting of a man already weakened, the words chosen with the economy of someone who knew his time was limited. I fear I have placed my daughter in a trap I built myself, believing it a shelter. If something happens to me before I can correct it, I ask you, as the only man in the Northern Territories whose judgment I have trusted without reservation for 30 years, to find her. She is cleverer than anyone has allowed her to be. She will need someone who can see that. Ellie read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and placed it on the table and did not speak for a moment. He knew, she said finally. He knew enough, Darius said. Not everything, but enough to be afraid. She nodded once and turned to the next document. He let her read at her own pace. He did not explain things she hadn't asked him to explain. When she asked questions, precise, specific questions about financial law, about compact jurisdiction, about the exact legal mechanism by which Thomas was being detained, he answered them fully and without condescension. Twice she caught him watching her work through a problem, and both times his expression held that same careful quality she was beginning to map. Not softness exactly, but attention of a particular kind, the kind that did not look away when things became complicated. By the time they rode out the following morning, she had a complete picture of what had been done to her family. The picture was ugly and exact, and she carried it with her like a coal, something that burned steadily without consuming itself, something that could be used. They traveled with 6 riders, moving at a pace that was fast but not reckless. Ellie rode her own horse, a dark bay mare from the way station stock, sturdy and even-tempered, and kept pace without difficulty, which she could see mildly surprise some of the riders, who had perhaps expected more fragility from the woman they had collected from the road in a wedding dress. She had been riding since she was 7. Her father had believed in it. Darius rode beside her for most of the first day. Not in front, not behind, beside. They did not talk constantly. There were long stretches of comfortable silence that she found unexpectedly easy, which she did not examine too closely because examining things too closely was how she had initially dismissed every warning sign about Edmund, telling herself she was being uncharitable, telling herself her discomfort was her own inadequacy. In the afternoon of the second day, when the terrain was beginning to shift from the dense northern pine forest into the rougher, more open landscape of the eastern borderlands, he said, "Your wolf." She kept her eyes on the road. "What about her?" "She's been suppressed," he said. Not an accusation. Purely observational, the way he said most things. Not just by the poison. Longer than that. Ellie was quiet for a moment. The bare hills rolled away on either side of the road. The dry grass, pale gold and silver in the afternoon light. The sky above them a hard, clear winter blue. "She has always been small," she said. "Quiet. Everyone in my father's house was a strong shifter. I was never..." She stopped. Tried again. "Constance called it a deficiency, from the time I was a child." "Constance was wrong," he said. The simplicity of it startled her. No elaboration, no diplomatic softening. Just the flat correction, delivered without drama. "You can't know that," she said. "I can smell your wolf," he said. "She is not small. She has been made to believe she is, which is different." He paused. "A wolf that is told often enough that it is inadequate will stop trying to be otherwise. It is not deficiency. It is damage." Ellie looked at the road ahead and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that wouldn't require more honesty than she was prepared to offer on horseback in the middle of the eastern borderlands. Her wolf, predictably, pressed forward at his words. That same steady leaning, that compass-finding north quality that Ellie had been firmly and repeatedly declining to interpret. She declined it again. She was very good at declining things. They arrived at the compact's eastern garrison, as the sun was dropping behind the hills, the last light turning the stone walls of the outpost amber and long-shadowed. It was a proper compact installation, staffed, fortified, flying the treaty banner, and the commander met them at the gate with the particular bearing of a man who had been expecting this visit and was uncertain whether to be relieved or nervous. The commander was nervous, as it turned out, for good reason. Darius met with him privately for 20 minutes. Ellie waited in the garrison's main hall with the riders, warming her hands at the fire and listening to the sounds of the outpost around her. Boots on stone floors, the distant stamp of horses, voices from the upper level. She was very still and very attentive, which was something she had learned to be in houses where the actual information was always happening in the rooms you weren't in. When Darius returned, his expression was the same as always. Controlled, readable only to someone who had been studying it for 2 days. But there was something different in the quality of his stillness, something that had sharpened. "Cressy sent a rider this morning," he said, low enough for only her to hear. "Before we arrived. Instructions to move Thomas to a secondary location. The coal in her chest burned hotter. He knows I ran. He knows you ran, and that you were collected by compact riders. Darius looked at her. He doesn't know it was me specifically. Not yet, but he is trying to remove Thomas before the compact can make a formal claim. How far is the secondary location? 4 hours south. His riders left this morning, which means they arrive tonight. He paused. We can be there before dawn if we leave within the hour. She was already standing. Then we leave within the hour. Something moved across his face. Brief, genuine, not the contained, almost smile she had seen before, but something more unguarded. He turned before she could examine it. They rode through the dark. Ellie had never ridden through the night before. It was nothing like she would have imagined. Not romantic, not frightening, but deeply physical. The cold pressing in from all sides, the horses moving carefully on the moonlit road, the sound of hooves and breathing and the distant call of a night bird somewhere in the dark hills. She focused on the mare's ears, on the rhythm, on staying present in her body rather than in the churning calculation of what waited at the end of the road. Beside her, Darius was a steady presence in the dark, a warmth, a solidity, the sound of his horse's breathing matching the rhythm of hers. At some point, without deciding to, she said, "She used to tell me he was disappointed in me, my father, that he had wanted a stronger wolf, a proper shifter, and that I had been a disappointment he was too kind to say aloud." The road moved beneath them. He didn't answer immediately, and she appreciated that. Appreciated that he understood some things needed space rather than instant comfort. "He wrote that you were cleverer than anyone had allowed you to be," Darius said finally. "That is not the language of a disappointed man." She held that, turned it over carefully, set it somewhere she could return to. They reached the secondary outpost an hour before dawn. A smaller installation, less formal, the kind used for way stops rather than permanent garrison. Darius's riders spread out around the perimeter, with the quiet efficiency she had come to recognize as their default state. And then Darius went to the door himself, and knocked with a particular pattern that she suspected meant something specific within compact protocol. The door opened. A young man stood in the doorway. He was thinner than she remembered, his dark hair longer, his eyes carrying the particular expression of someone who had been carefully not showing fear for a very long time. He looked at the riders. He looked at Darius. Then he looked past them both, and his eyes found Ellie in the torchlight. "Ellie," Thomas said. His voice broke cleanly on her name, the way voices broke when the thing they had been holding dissolved all at once. She was off the horse before she had decided to move. She held her brother in the cold doorway of the outpost for a long time, his arms tight around her, her face against his shoulder, both of them saying nothing because there was nothing sufficient to say. She could feel him shaking, the particular shaking of someone whose body had been carrying sustained tension for months and had finally been given permission to release it. She became aware, after a moment, of the other riders giving them space, of the deliberate sound of Darius moving away from the doorway, his back to them, speaking quietly to his men, giving her this without making it smaller by witnessing it. When she finally straightened, her face was wet. She did not apologize for it. Thomas looked at her, at the riding clothes, the dark circles, the evidence of 2 days of hard travel written into her posture, and then past her at the Alpha King, standing a careful distance away in the torchlight. "You have a great deal to explain," Thomas said to her. "I know," she said. "Starting with why you are not currently married to Edmund Cressy." "That," she said, "is the most straightforward part of the story." Behind her, very quietly, she heard Darius make a sound that might, in a man less controlled, have been a laugh. The Compact Council convened 12 days later in the great hall of Darius's seat at Ironhold. A fortress of dark stone and high vaulted ceilings that smelled of torch resin and old wood, and the particular cold that lived in stone walls regardless of how many fires burned against it. 17 PAC representatives, their seconds, their legal voices. The hall was full in a way that compressed the air, made every sound carry, made every silence land with weight. Ellie sat at the council table, not beside Darius, not behind him, not in an anteroom waiting to be summoned. At the table, in a chair that had been placed there by Darius himself that morning without explanation or announcement, as though it were simply the correct arrangement and anyone who found it remarkable was welcome to say so. No one said so. She had spent 12 days preparing for this, not resting, not recovering, preparing. Darius had given her access to every document the Compact's investigation had produced, every intercepted letter, every debt ledger, every record of Thomas's restricted movements. She had read all of it, and then she had organized it, cross-referenced it, built the complete architecture of what Constance and Edmund had constructed over 4 years. And she had done it with the focused precision of her father's daughter, the one who had spent 2 years alone in his apothecary wing reading everything he had ever written. Thomas sat 2 seats down from her. He was still thinner than she liked, still carrying the shadow of 18 months of careful imprisonment in the set of his shoulders. But his eyes were clear, and his jaw was set, and he had spent the 12 days at Ironhold eating properly and sleeping in a room where no one controlled his correspondence. When the council opened, and the charges were formally read, conspiracy to commit murder, fraudulent manipulation of a compact marriage contract, illegal detention of a compact citizen, sustained poisoning of a sitting high chancellor, the hall went very quiet. Edmund Cressy, seated across the table with his legal voice beside him, kept his expression neutral for approximately 4 minutes. Then the first document was presented, Constance's letters to him, in her own handwriting, detailing the compound and the dosing schedule, and his neutrality developed a crack. Ellie watched the crack form and did not look away from it. She had thought, in the days leading to this, that she would feel something more dramatic when she finally sat across a table from Edmund and watched the thing he had built begin to collapse. Something fierce and consuming, the kind of feeling that announced itself. Instead, what she felt was quiet. The coal in her chest, the thing that had been burning steadily since the morning she smelled wolfsbane in the chapel flowers, gave one final, clean pulse of heat and then settled into something cooler, not cold, just resolved. She presented 3 documents herself when Darius indicated her turn. Her voice was steady. She spoke without flourish, without performance, with the exact precision her father had taught her in his study on the evenings when he had brought her in to observe his council work. Facts are more devastating than emotion, Ellie. Emotion can be dismissed. Facts cannot. When she finished, the council chamber was completely silent. The Alpha King's judgment came at the end of the 3rd hour of proceedings, delivered in the same low, unhurried voice that had said, "Perfect. I needed a wife on a frozen road 2 weeks ago, and it was absolute." Edmund Cressy was stripped of his PAC leadership and his compact standing, his territorial claims dissolved, his financial assets frozen pending restitution to the Voss estate. Constance was remanded to the compact's custody pending formal criminal proceedings, her claim to the Voss title nullified in its entirety. The 3 creditor families who had knowingly participated in the financial conspiracy received formal censure and trade restrictions. The Voss estate and all associated land grants were restored to their rightful heirs, Eleonora Voss and Thomas Voss, jointly held. Ellie sat with this information and let it become real, which took longer than she expected. She had spent so many months, years perhaps, existing in a world where her own name attached to her own inheritance was a thing being quietly taken from her. Letting it come back felt strange, like a joint that had been held wrong for so long that being set correctly was almost painful. Thomas found her hand under the table and held it. She let him. Edmund was escorted from the hall by compact guards without drama, without the scene she had perhaps expected. He did not look at her as he passed. She watched him go, and felt only the complete absence of what she had once mistaken for safety, which turned out to be something that had never existed. Some losses, she was learning, were simply the correction of errors. They deserved to be felt clearly, not mourned. Constance was a different matter. She was brought in after Edmund, smaller than Ellie had ever seen her, not physically, but in the way that stripped authority reduced people, made them simply human, rather than the large, managing presence they had always occupied in a room. She looked at Ellie across the council table with an expression that moved through several things, before settling on something that might have been, in a different woman, the beginning of shame. Ellie looked back at her steadily. She had prepared something to say. She had written it, revised it, considered it carefully over 12 nights at Ironhold, while the fortress settled around her, and the fire burned low in the hearth of the room Darius had given her. In the end, she did not say any of it. She had prepared it for herself, she realized, to organize what she felt, to give it shape. Not because Constance deserved the precision of it. She said nothing, and found that nothing was sufficient. The council hall emptied slowly as the session closed. Thomas stayed beside her until the room had thinned, then pressed his shoulder briefly against hers in the way he had done since they were children. A wordless communication that meant we are still here, and went to speak with the compact's legal secretary about the estate restoration documentation. Darius came to stand beside her when the room was nearly empty, not across the table. Beside her, with the same comfortable proximity he had maintained for 12 days, close enough to be present, with enough space that she had never once felt managed or crowded. "It's done," she said. "The formal part," he agreed. She looked at the empty council table, the documents stacked and sealed, the chairs at angles where people had pushed back from them, the torches burning down toward their last hour. The hall smelled of beeswax and old stone, and the particular aftermath of large gatherings, a human warmth already beginning to dissipate. "My father would have liked this room," she said. "He liked rooms where things were decided properly." "I know," Darius said. "He sat in this room twice. Both times, he argued with me about Northern grain policy for 3 hours and was right both times." She looked at him. Something loosened in her chest at the image, her father, alive, difficult, precise, sitting at this table arguing with the Alpha King. Alive in a way she hadn't pictured him in a long time. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. He nodded once. Then, with the same deliberate care he applied to everything, "I want to ask you something. And I want you to understand that whatever you answer, nothing that was decided today changes. Your estate is yours. Thomas is free. The judgment stands regardless." She turned to face him fully. "Ask." "I meant what I said on the road," he said. "Not the political reasoning. I told you the political reasoning because it was true, and you deserved the full picture. But it was not the reason I said it." He met her eyes steadily, the dark gaze that she had spent 12 days learning to read, that she now understood held more than it ever showed. "I have been watching you build the case that put Cressy in front of this council. I have been watching you with your brother, with my writers, with the documents and the evidence and the decisions that needed making. I have been watching you for 12 days, and I have not once seen you be less than exactly what you are." He paused. "I would like the opportunity to keep watching, if you are willing." Her wolf did not lean this time. Her wolf stood up, fully, completely, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, and simply was present, solid and certain in a way that Ellie had stopped believing her quiet, shy wolf was capable of. She thought of Edmund's smile at the altar, and how she had understood even then that it contained no actual recognition of her. She thought of what it felt like to sit at a council table and speak facts in her own voice and watch them land. She thought of her father's letter. She is cleverer than anyone has allowed her to be. She thought of a frozen road and the smell of wood smoke and pine resin, and a man who had said not the reason I said it, because imprecision was a form of dishonesty, he did not permit himself. "I have conditions," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I expected nothing less. I want full access to Compact Council proceedings, not as an observer, as a participant. Done. I want Thomas given a formal Compact appointment appropriate to his education. He has spent 18 months being kept deliberately idle. He is not idle. Also done. And I want... She stopped, steadied herself. I want this to be chosen. Not recognized, not accepted because the bond exists, not arrived at because it is the logical conclusion of a political situation. I want it to be chosen. Darius was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, the quality of something said carefully because it mattered. I have been choosing, he said, since a woman refused my hand from a saddle and gripped the strap herself instead. The torches burned in the old stone hall. Outside the high windows, the winter sky was beginning to shift toward the deep blue that preceded dark, the first stars becoming visible at the horizon's edge. Somewhere in the fortress, she could hear Thomas's voice, animated, clear, the sound of someone who had been quiet for too long and was no longer required to be. Ellie looked at Darius, at the scar along his jaw, the dark, steady eyes, the careful stillness of a man who had waited 12 days and would have waited considerably longer because he understood the difference between patience and pressure. She took one step forward. He did not move toward her. He waited, the way he had always waited, present without demanding. And she reached up and placed her hand against his jaw, her cold fingers against the old scar, and felt him exhale slowly, something in the enormous controlled stillness of him releasing by a fraction. Then we begin, she said. He turned his face slightly into her hand, just barely, just enough. The Voss estate was restored by spring. Thomas took his compact appointment and proved, within 6 months, exactly what Ellie had told them he would, a precise, difficult, principled negotiator who argued with Darius about northern trade policy with the same exhausting accuracy their father had. Darius bore this with equanimity and was privately, clearly pleased. Constance stood trial before the full compact court in the 3rd month and was sentenced to permanent removal from the Northern Territories, her assets dissolved, her title extinguished. She did not look at Ellie during sentencing. Ellie did not require her to. Edmund Cressy's pack restructured under new leadership within the year, the 3 families who had left returning when the debts and the fear that had driven them out were finally cleared. The territory stabilized. The compact held. The gray-haired medic who had wrapped Ellie in a blanket at the way station turned out to be Ironhold's chief physician, a woman named Sarah, who had served Darius's house for 20 years, and who told Ellie on their 3rd meeting, bluntly, without softening, that her wolf had been suppressed by a combination of environmental stress and sustained low-level exposure to a compound that Constance had apparently been administering since Ellie's adolescence, likely in the same quiet, patient way she had administered everything else. With proper care, Sarah said, the suppression would lift. It did. Not all at once, gradually. The way feeling returned to a cold limb, slightly painful, undeniably real. Her wolf, it turned out, was not small. She was not quiet by nature. She was simply herself, steady, watchful, perceptive in ways that had always been there beneath the damage, waiting for a world that was safe enough to stand up in. On the morning of the bonding ceremony, a private affair, the great hall of Ironhold, with only Thomas and the riders and Sarah and the compact's ceremonial elder. Ellie stood at the front of the room in deep green wool and her mother's silver earrings, and felt the specific, irreversible solidity of a life that had been built rather than inherited. Darius stood across from her with the careful, present attention that she now understood was simply who he was, a man who looked at what was in front of him without looking past it. Thomas stood to her left and was, for once, not arguing with anyone. When it was done, she was Luna of the Northern Reaches. Not by birth, not by arrangement, not by a poisoned isle she had nearly walked to the end of. By choice, clearly made, in full knowledge of what she was choosing. Her wolf stood steady in her chest, solid and certain. Finally at home. Outside the high windows of Ironhold, spring was beginning in the way spring always began in the Northern Territories. Slowly, stubbornly, without asking permission, the frozen ground finally yielding to something that had been waiting patiently beneath it all along.